in Asia and furthered the stability of the region. Talk a little about that, and why do you think China was able to seize that course?
Well, I've tried to create a new index of what I call geopolitical competence, and in which I put the EU at a 2. It's the former Soviet Union at a 2. It's from 1 to 10. Mm-hmm. The former Soviet Union at a 2 because it disappeared. The EU at a 4 because around all its borders it has unsafe borders. The United States I give a 6, but I give China an 8 or 9. And the reason why I give China an 8 or 9 is because, whenever a new great power emerges, throughout history you see as a great power emerges rising levels of tension and rising danger of conflict. But China is emerging in a massive way without creating any tremors. Now that requires enormous geopolitical dexterity. And one of the most brilliant moves that the Chinese government made, because they knew that at some point in time the United States might try to contain China. I mean, you don't have to be a genius to anticipate that. So what do the Chinese do? They launch a preemptive strike. And what is their preemptive strike? They export their peace and prosperity to all their neighbors. And this explains why the fastest growing trade flows in the world are not in Europe, not across the Atlantic, not in North America, not across the Pacific, but between China and its neighbors. And this represents a major geopolitical decision, whether it's between China and Japan, China and India. And I can tell you that one of the most brilliant moves that the Chinese did was to propose a free trade agreement with Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia you might call the soft underbelly of China, right? 500 million people who in the past had been used by the United States to contain China in the Cold War. So what does China do? Propose a free trade agreement. And not only did they propose a free trade agreement, they concluded it in record time. And even before they concluded it, they gave the ASEAN countries of Southeast Asia, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, an early harvest by giving them unilateral concessions into the Chinese market. Now, if only Europe could copy what China did and export its prosperity to Africa, it would make it a much safer world for Europe in the long run. But obviously, what China can do today, Europe still cannot do. It shows how far ahead China is in geopolitical competence.
And there's a learning cycle here that you're describing, which is quite fascinating. Namely, the West had much to teach. Asia learned, and in some respects, the West has ceased to learn, whereas Asia has built on what it learned and is actually, in some cases, navigating a new course.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, you see, the tragedy about the West is that the early generations in the West succeeded because they had open minds and they were willing to learn and experiment and be pragmatic. What you have today in the West is a population that is on top of the mountain but has never struggled to climb the mountain themselves. And they assume that their natural place is to be up on the mountain. So they become arrogant, smug, condescending vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And when they watch the rest of the world climbing the mountain, right, they look down and they say, why can't you become democratic overnight? What's wrong with you? Excuse me, even the United States, right? When you look at it, you proposed the principle of equality of man in 1776. It took you 100 years to get rid of slavery after that. It took you another 150 years to give the vote to the women. It took you 200 years to effectively give the vote to the black people. It took you so long to get to the top of the mountain. And yet, when you expect other societies to change overnight. And this is where the dialogue between the East and the West is going to change. Because clearly now, there is a remarkable degree of resentment in the East towards lectures by Westerners, telling them this is how you should transform your societies. And the attitude of many in Asia is, go fix your own societies first. We are doing a reasonable job. Don't teach us what to do. Look at what you are doing that is wrong in your societies.
There's a story in your book that I found fascinating, which is the difference in the way the American elite prepared for the occupation of Japan in comparison with the lack of preparation for the invasion and then occupation of Iraq. Talk a little about that, and how do you explain the difference?
Well, I think the big difference between the American occupation in 2005 of Japan.
You mean
of 1945 in Japan and 2003 in Iraq. The big difference is that the occupying powers in Japan knew that they had to understand Japanese culture. I mean, one of the most critical decisions that was made in 1945 was not to put the emperor on trial, but to say, hey, if we want to preserve stability in Japan, and we have to preserve social and political stability in Japan, you have to preserve some critical institutions. So you have to understand Japanese history and culture. Now, the people who went to Iraq were the most incredibly arrogant people. And they thought they didn't have to study Iraqi culture at all. And they made disastrous decisions, this de-Baathification. So you remove the entire middle class, the entire ruling elite, and threw them out. And of course, the society falls apart. The glue that holds a society completely fell apart. I make an even more telling comparison between the way the Japanese occupied Singapore in 1942, and even though they were brutal, they made sure that even the British colonial officers who were running Singapore were allowed to stay in their place. I gave the incredible example of the Botanic Gardens in Singapore, which is a world treasure, frankly. And when the Japanese sent a botanist from Tokyo to Singapore, they told the British botanist, please stay. You have to preserve these beautiful gardens. By contrast, the Americans allowed the looting of these incredibly ancient treasures in the Museum of Baghdad. Now that's incredible incompetence, And I'm surprised. What amazes me about all this discourse is that so few minds in America keep asking this fundamental question: why have we become so incompetent? What has gone wrong? And I think a lot of it has to do with ideological arrogance that has grown in the Western mind. And this ideological arrogance has to be removed. Otherwise, it will become a major obstacle to the West understanding the nature of the real world that is emerging.
You talk about that, and let's discuss that now, namely a set of principles. We're not now talking about the pillars that help in the march toward modernity, but we're really talking about the end of the Cold War and a misunderstanding of why we won the Cold War and how we won it, leading to the notion that we can now face the world on the mountain and give it a new set of principles that are